That's also a big struggle. Yeah.
All right. So look, the first thing I wanted to cover off really was your work, and particularly the empirical case studies around how measurement and evaluation actually inhibits or constrains the decision making of academics and makes them make decisions about what activities they'll undertake at the expense of some of the other missions, critical missions of universities. Now, if you'll indulge me with a slightly long and convoluted question or series of points. So the first point is, I think that the implications of your work on that are huge. I think the idea that we can actually change the trajectory of scientific discovery effectively goes against our entire understanding of how science progresses. And that goes back through, I think I mentioned Polanyi, but through Kuhn as well. You know, it's not just shifting paradigms. It's not this transcendent thing and this unfolding towards some universal truth. It's actually being shaped by social pressures and external forces along the way. And that's a very different way of thinking about science to how most researchers would think about what they do for a living. So I think that's got large implications for how we actually think about the progress of science. And I think following from that, there's a bad side to that, which is we could inhibit the progress of science. But there's also potentially an upside to that, which is we can actually mobilize science if we can harness our ability to influence it correctly. And I think about that particularly in the current moment around COVID and the mass mobilization of scientific effort towards finding a vaccine. I spoke with Jonathan Grant about this as well, and he likened it to the effort of science and research during World War II. And I think perhaps they're the upsides of how you can actually use that ability to shape science positively, but there's also the downside of you could actually just ruin it along the way. So if that's not too convoluted and complex a set of propositions, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you. That's actually an excellent starting point for the conversation. Maybe I can also take a step back, because I came to this topic of looking at interactions between evaluation and knowledge production through STS, so Science and Technology Studies. So for me, the whole idea of the interrelation between politics, civil society, research was actually something of a starting point, or an assumption built into how we think about knowledge production in the first place. So I learned early on in my studies that this type of thinking about what's sometimes referred to as mode one knowledge, that this idea of that there's this kind of primarily cognitive endeavor that you work towards kind of universal knowledge and fact building. So knowledge creation doesn't work like that. And that is actually, that was so interesting also to that opened up a whole area of research for me. So that really started with this foundational book, Leviathan and the Air Pump, by Steve Shapin and Simon Scheffer, in which they really, it's a historical project, but I think it frames our discussion, if I share that a little bit in brief, because they describe how knowledge production is always something that has to be literally or literarily in text and in visuals, but also in social technologies embedded. So it's also always built in that it's a contextual process. It's contextually embedded. And that's, from that perspective, thinking about performance measurement or research evaluation and research governance, it makes sense because you consider the interrelations between a political arena, national funding agencies play a role, other organizational forms and institutional bases for science that constitute the process of knowledge production. So from that basis, you can then consider, okay, we can see in the last century or so that science has become more of a profession than maybe a calling that it used to be perceived, like before the 1900s. So it's now really a state-governed or even militarily funded endeavor. It's really interlinked. So you have accountability relations, you have performance measurement, and that has perverse effects, but it also has, as you mentioned in your introduction, it creates opportunities to shape that process in directions that are potentially more beneficial to the actors in the system, including society. So the work we started to do from 2012 onwards was basically to look at like a really open question. So how do scientists on the ground make judgment calls about what's interesting, what's relevant, and who decides, what kind of factors play into that decision making? In an email you sent me, you referred to the work of Diana Hicks, for instance, and also Linda Butler. They look more at macro level developments and also mainly at the output side of things. And we were interested in what happens before something becomes an output in the first place. And then so it's a typical lab studies, STS type of approach to doing research. So you go in and you participate, you observe, you interview. And then you see, in our case, you see in biomedical and life sciences, that those were the first projects. You see those interactions between political systems, between national evaluation systems, but also between like institutional assessment schemes and the shop floor. You see those play out, and then there's this interesting dynamic between field level development, so globalized science, especially in biomedicine and life sciences. It's extremely big science, and the institutional context in which scientists operate, in which forms of performance measurement make a huge difference to how the institution is structured and organized. So we were really teasing out what role judgment calls in a broad sense. So not only where do I publish, but also what is a good question to begin with, how those take shape in the daily work of researchers. And so we didn't want to go in. There was a lot of discussion at the time about perverse effects, especially in biomedicine, of the journal impact factor or the H-index. But with those science studies lenses on, we wanted to describe first and not like come in with this frame in which we already thought that it might have perverse effects. Perverse effects is a term that I'm also not very happy with, because it assumes that there's some agency that decides what it should look like. So for instance, a bibliometric community that says this indicator should be used like that, and you're doing it all wrong in practice. We are trying to study how these indicators and other criteria for quality are used in these labs on the ground, and it takes different shapes. It's not but the interrelation between asking certain questions, starting certain collaborations, and aiming for certain types of output, and the knowledge that is then created or not created, that is the focus of the work. So I don't know if it's up to us to then decide, yes, this is completely perverse, or we should focus on completely other things in biomedicine. But it then does raise questions for all of us to address. So is this really relevant science? For whom is it relevant? Who benefits from this knowledge? Who's the audience for it? If we're all aiming for high impact peer-reviewed journal articles, that is a certain community you're aiming for. But well, the whole discussion around societal relevance or broader impacts also suggests that well, there are other concerns that science and scholarship is invited to think about as well for the past couple of decades. So without becoming too normative, it's raising these issues through the field work and in the interviews.
So on the point of impact, it's probably a good launching point for another discussion, because I think my sense is that the impact agenda, amongst other things, I think perhaps the open access agenda, I think even the quality evaluation agenda, and those large accountability narratives actually point to a breakdown in the social compact between researchers and the public that founds universities and funds researchers. And I'd be interested in your view, if you have one, on to what extent impact is a solution to that breakdown in the social compact. If you agree, you might disagree. But to what extent impact can address that, and to what extent looking at impact is itself going to have perverse or unintended consequences that we're not planning for?
Yeah, it's a bit of an easy answer to say probably both. So I guess there's, and we are experiencing an interesting set of decades. So you see a lot of changes in the way we do research, in the way we organize it, technological advances, also large demographic changes in science and scholarship. So a lot of these things also are changing the way we do science and scholarship. So it's not like a stable state thing. You also have gender and ethnic composition differences now, and also hugely rapidly changing global economic circumstances, political circumstances that are also transforming science. So it's like a moving target. And there's this increasing, I guess we could agree on that, increasing demand of science and scholarship for certain societal benefits. And that, I think, changes the way in which university and other knowledge institutes have connections with certain publics and also patrons. So that has a lot of complex consequences, including ethical concerns that are raised, like research integrity concerns. I don't know if impact is a solution, but it's definitely a factor that plays into this changing configuration. So the relationship between scientists and scholars and their patrons is changing a lot. And there are other actors coming into this scene, including commercial actors. Obviously, commercialization is also a big factor here. So for instance, globalization of research, I was thinking about that because in your email you also alluded to the Australian situation, which you of course are much more familiar with. I only see some headlines like the funding agency dynamics you alluded to. So so it has complex effects, this globalization. You see a big science globalization, internationalization, technological changes, huge infrastructures for doing the work, big science, a global scale. But then also that has effects on the national system. So that might actually result in forms of nationalism that have quite detrimental effects to the ways in which science and scholarship can be executed. So maybe even forms of closeness that we weren't anticipating, forms of secrecy that we weren't anticipating, because it's an increasingly competitive, globalized space. So that is obviously an effect that probably most of us find undesirable. But again, this moment in which these relations between society, policy, political spheres, industry, and science are becoming more entangled also gives opportunities. And the COVID-19 situation is a great example. For many reasons. I think it hopefully also helps debunk this mythical image of how science works. So you see here frontier science in action, basically, and everyone can see it. Everyone can see it play out in the media with all its uncertainties and collaborative efforts, with all the risks and also competition. And the adjustments that continuously need to be made. So you see that science doesn't operate like this mythical image of a rational trajectory moving towards like immutable facts, something completely different. It's a lot of experts working together to create knowledge. And ideally, I think they do that with the people that are actually affected by it. And with politicians, alongside politicians who have their own responsibilities and their own judgment calls to make. But that is, I think, a good example of how science and scholarship is very, very socially embedded. And to do that well, I think we should really think about the social robustness of science and not work with this pipe dream idea of basic science and then that gets translated at some point to societal relevance. It's socially embedded from the start, and that makes it very complex also when you think about how to then organize for that and how to create accountability structures that do justice to that process, which is very complex. There's no, I think, easy answer to that, but the way we currently organize research evaluation doesn't really cut it.
It seems that one of the things that COVID exposes is that science can happen outside of the traditional mechanisms of science, which are relatively exclusive or exclusionary. So, peer review is a very opaque process. The dynamics of publication is long and drawn out and highly politicized. The nature of disciplines is highly contested and political, etc. All of these big cumbersome mechanisms of science. At the moment, science is working without those mechanisms slowing it down, I guess. I imagine that at some point you have to go back and peer review everything and validate all of this work that's being done, but really at the moment it's about sharing ideas and generating ideas and really progressing as quickly as possible towards a solution. I'd be interested just to hear your thoughts on whether that exposes maybe that myth of science, as in those mechanisms really protect a special space for scientists to go about their business without anybody looking inside and asking what's going on there. But clearly, and we're seeing it now, there's another way of doing this.
Yes, that is actually, I guess those are issues that predate COVID-19. So I think a lot of recent work in science studies, meta-research, has focused on major flaws in the structure of science, forms of bias, forms of structural inequality, closeness, secrecy, all these issues. And the advent of, for instance, preprints, which you can clearly see being used on a large scale in this current moment in the pandemic, has put to the fore this issue about, or this question about what is quality control in science, and who is it for, indeed, who participates in that, and is it operating the way it should? So that is extremely interesting from a science studies perspective. And I think part of the way in which we organize peer review is totally not appropriate anymore for the way in which science works now and the scale at which it operates. So I think peer review works well, for instance, if you have a relatively small community of experts and peers that exchange views and make work better through peer review. But a large part of the work in science doesn't work like that anymore. And it's really interesting to see what is opened up when we see peer review or preprints, emerge on the stage. That potentially gives an opportunity for more interdisciplinary engagement with certain forms of science. More people can see it, and but it also, I think, will probably, and you mentioned that as well in your question, will probably not be introduced everywhere in the same way, in each discipline in the same way. So it was, of course, booming in astronomy and other fields, but not so in social sciences and humanities for a long time. You will probably see the emergence of those types of platforms elsewhere, but I still indeed think that the process of validating forms of data and claims is still necessary. I'm not sure if that should be like in a journal context, but that's the way we organize it now. Also, that is obviously tied to careers and incentive and reward structures. So that stamp of quality control that the journal now provides, with all its downsides as well, with impact factor dynamics, that is still like a ticket to a position or to a tenured position in science. So unless we work on that and change that, this will probably not change very quickly.
And I guess that's the next thing I'm interested in hearing your views on. Performance management of individuals or programs or whatever it might be. Here and in other places, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same there, but it's certainly still publications, grant income, and research student are the three kind of touch points of countable things that go into building an academic research career. And if we start to think about the emergence of impact, it's resistant to that kind of easy, countable measurement paradigm. And in fact, there are probably an infinite number of legitimate activities that you could pursue under the banner of leading towards impact. So how do we in the future have that accounted for in local level career progression and performance management, because it is very different from the ready-made solution of get your 4 publications this year, apply for 2 grants and supervise 3 students and you progress to the next level. Impact is a very different thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you look at some of the good practices that are emerging across the globe in terms of new forms of assessment at the individual level, what they do well is shift the focus to what the work is about. So that can be on an institutional level. So what is the strategic plan or the vision of this work? I'm saying work because it's not only research but also teaching and outreach activities, for instance. But the research and the teaching and the outreach, those are forms for that. The prior step we should make is think about the purpose and the values of the work in the first place, and that rarely happens. We are so focused on outputs and outcomes that we forget to think about the purpose of the work, and that is quite crucial. So you can make very hard agreements about what you will assess in a certain period of time, but if we fail to look at the mission of the work, or missions of the work, or the missions of the individual in a certain institutional context, it has no ground. It is just an externalized set of performance metrics often. So what we've been trying to do, and it's definitely so a collective endeavor with colleagues across the world, is to make that point and then start to devise systems that account for that. I'm sorry, that pun wasn't intended, but so we make that point also in the Leiden Manifesto. One of the principles clearly also states that so the measurement of performance should be really linked to the mission of the research. And if you look at an individual level assessment for hiring or promoting someone, that is a very particular context. Both are very different evaluation moments in the first place, I should say. They are very different ways of making a judgment call. So first you want to assess, does this person fit in this institutional context? We tend to think about, can we hire stars that will raise our profile or pump the rankings or boost the rankings? That kind of perversity is clearly visible in the system. So I think the move that should be made, and that is also happening at certain places now already, luckily there are examples, is okay, what are you bringing here? So you come here and apply for a position. What will you do in the next 5 years? What will your work be about? And who is that for? And how does it fit with the institutional program and strategic vision of the work? Then if you start asking those questions, you also notice that we all collectively have stopped asking those types of questions. So a lot of institutions don't have a strategic vision apart from relatively empty terms like we want to be excellent or relevant or whatever that means. So this demands a completely different form of leadership in academia, in which people have the guts to say, we're going to focus for 5 years on that. And you may be an excellent researcher, but your work just doesn't fit here. And we want to collectively work on this agenda. So how are you going to contribute? And that can be a very basic science agenda. I'm not saying it should all be about impact or broader relevance. It can be a really basic research agenda. But then the contours of the work are much clearer, and you can then start to think about forms of output that fit, or forms of engagement with societal actors that matter for that project or program. And it's still not easy to then trace those relations and outputs and outcomes, but it's much better anchored in an idea and a program that it's often right now. So that is the move we're trying to make in talking about good practices for individual hiring and promotion.
And can I just ask? You mentioned there are some examples. What are places that are starting to do this well?
Well, yeah. So these are close by from my perspective. So those I know best. So in Belgium, you have the University of Ghent. They recently acquired some fame by saying, okay, we're not going to do this rat race anymore. We're going to stop this. And they've introduced a new system of hiring and promotion that attempts to do something like I just described. So they also, they do this for senior staff. The issue of doing this for junior scholars or early career scholars, I should say, that is a different ballgame. Senior staff should be able to make a narrative around their mission of the work. And they should be able to relate that to an institution and their missions. So they hire people on the basis of what they bring and certain agreements about what they will do in 5 years' time. And they don't do performance measurement or appraisal conversations every year, which is the norm in many countries. They do facilitate the researchers by coaching them, but they only do an assessment every, I think, 5 years or so. So that gives much more room and space. And there are still really hard criteria that they're being held accountable for. But it starts with this narrative, basically, about the purpose of the research, teaching, and impact. So that is an example. The University Medical Center Utrecht was one of the first to start innovating. And that was really brave because they are in this context of biomedical research, usually competitive environment. But I think they also had a very good, almost normative argument to make clear that this change from performance measurements to broader impact that made much sense. I mean, they are in a context in which people are also treated. They're also a hospital. So the work and the science should really benefit that kind of context. So basically help cure patients. A lot of resistance, obviously. But it's a really interesting example of trying to stop this common argument people make about, well, we cannot affect change because we're part of this global international system. We are much too small to affect change. They just started to do it and said, yes, that is possible. So here you go. This is a system we created together with our researchers. It's grounded in the norms of the community. So let's just do this. Let's experiment with a different way of doing assessment. And that has been going on for a couple of years now, and everyone's really interested in how that will, in the long term, affect the science. It's really, I mean, the period, I think they started a couple of years ago. But I think that if you would do a large-scale quantitative analysis at that institutional level, you can probably trace, and that's what our conversation started with, you can probably trace a different orientation of the content of the science because they've changed this assessment criteria framework. Some stuff will not be considered relevant anymore, so you will definitely start seeing that in their outputs.
It seems the obvious question, and it comes back to your your starting point for thinking about this, but the obvious question is, whose mission is the institution capturing in their strategy? And it's easy if you're a hospital and your mission is really defined by your actual mission. So your strategic mission is quite clear, and it's save lives and improve health outcomes, full stop. But not every research organisation has that neat package available to them. So do you have views on how universities can go beyond those empty terms like we want to be excellent, we want to be relevant, we want to be global, we want to be world leading, etc. And actually, where do you start to identify the mission of the institution? And again, whose mission? And it comes back to how are these organisations embedded within the broader social context, and what's their responsibility and accountability there?
That is a great question. It's also something I'm thinking about a lot. Also with respect to what type of leadership is then required, because you need to take into account a lot of things at the same time. You cannot outsource that type of decision making to rankings or to other forms of externalized measurements of success. I'm reminded of work by two French colleagues who made a classification of types of universities. I think that would be a starting point for our conversation. If you only focus on universities, universities are obviously not the only knowledge-producing institutions in the world, definitely not. But thinking about universities, there's a whole historical development behind where these institutions are now. It's not easy to change that, but that's also a starting point for thinking about what is their role in the region or in the national context or in the international context. So if I take my own university, Leiden University is one of the classical universities, very old universities in the Netherlands. So here it's academic freedom and a very broad profile, basically, if I would summarize what the university is about. But if you take that seriously, this very broad range of disciplines that it would house or should house, because you want to be that kind of university, you should devise an accountability and performance measurement system that doesn't have detrimental effects for parts of the social science and humanities, because they are part of your building blocks. Is this a university that does a lot of regional impact type of work? Where I'm not sure, but the profile is definitely oriented towards excellent, very broad disciplinary scope. But there are typologies of different forms of universities that may help us think about what the missions should be about. And it's probably a good way forward if we ask of university leadership to make more explicit what their university should do and which relations they want to maintain and with whom. And that is something that, at least in the university context, I know has become really hard. And that trickles down, that effect, to other layers of decision making. So, for instance, deans at faculty level, in the university system that we are in, they have a rotating, those are rotating positions. So they are there for a couple of years and then they go back to doing research, which makes it extremely politically laden to make decisions around the direction of the work, because you're going to be perceived as preaching for your own, how do you say that in English? Choir?
Preaching to the choir, yeah.
Yes. So it's not an easy way forward, but it's a highly political question, the one you're raising. So whose mission is this, and can we also include other publics in developing research agendas? So there's an extremely interesting experiment in the Netherlands in which we now have a national science agenda that was partly shaped by questions submitted by the general public. It was then curated by experts, but we do have that now, and that now shapes funding allocation. So that is an interesting moment in time in which this question about who's the work for is put in experimental context. So national level science agendas, funding allocation, moving in that direction. It's not literally earmarked, but it's increasingly moving towards like broader relevance type of work. It's really a complex environment in which, for instance, in the European context, basic blue sky research is really difficult to gain funding for. So there's a huge discussion around the European Research Council type of funding that does provide for that. You've probably also maybe picked that up in the media, but recently around COVID-19, there was this moment in which they said, well, come on, ERC, you should now also work towards finding solutions and not do this kind of blue sky thing anymore. So it's a highly political question. I don't know like an easy answer, but it's definitely something that scientists should not only try to answer themselves because of that social embedding of the work, and the responsibilities are also then distributed.
And I think, I mean, you may disagree, but I think part of the not yet articulated implications of your work is that the idea of academic freedom, which is premised on this universal truth and this moving towards universal truth, and if left to their own devices, scientists will just get there eventually. I think your work actually points out that the fallacy of academic freedom as a concept in the first place, and I think there is a very positive side to that, as much as there would be a perceived negative side to that, and that is the kind of thing you're talking about in the Netherlands with the slight opening up and democratization of the process of the scientific agenda, and connecting the agenda back to a public. And I think you allude to this a little bit in what you've just been saying, but it seems that one of the big limitations is the availability of institutional funding, or funding that can be mobilised strategically like that. And I think it's really acute in Australia and the UK, where more than 50% of our research funding is tied up in individual project grants that go to individual researchers.
Yes.
And it's very much in that liberal tradition of peer review, the best science, etc. And very little strategic funding sits in the hands of the research leadership inside a university to actually do anything strategic and mobilise things towards something that looks like a social or civic outcome. I'd just be interested in your thoughts in and around those bits and pieces.
I wholeheartedly agree with that assessment. If we indeed conclude from our work that the local context partly shapes what is considered relevant and responsible research, and what kind of values are embedded in that, and how they are shaped also by external factors. It also, like the flip side of that would be indeed to argue for that is actually the level in which decision making should take place, where people know best what goes into the work and what creates high quality work. Hopefully embedded in a community that makes sense. So that looks different for basic science than for highly embedded social science. But that is the context in which you can really think about truly relevant questions, projects, and outcomes. And funding plays a huge role. So if we would have a more stable system of funding research on a national and institutional level, that is not given out by competitive grants or by earmarked funding, that would help a lot. I mean, I think part of the things we find in our work are a result of what some refer to as projectification. So you have this temporal element. There's funding for a couple of years, there's a project for a couple of years, you have to do a PhD project for a couple of years. That structures so much of the work. It structures the type of questions that people can address and who they can collaborate with and what type of time frame. And that is creating this really anxious, stressed environment. And it's really then dependent on the context in which, for instance, a PhD student works. If they get enough of a protected space to actually sit down and do careful work. Yeah, the opposite image is much more common these days. So if we would have more, well, I'm not sure it's more money, but where the money sits and where the decision-making power sits, and how structural the funding is, I guess, is crucial. And I totally agree with that assessment. That's creating a lot of the problems that we see.
Yeah, I agree. And I think to come back to your example of the hospital-based research taking 5-year assessment timeframes, I mean, what that does is move from the projectification into something more like program management. So it's not about discrete projects, it's actually about a program of work. And it seems to me that thinking about research as a program is a lot more amenable to the kinds of things that we're talking about, and makes a lot more sense than 3-year projects that have a start and a finish and outcomes and outputs and then the next one.
Yeah, indeed. And one of the very problematic effects of that soft money logics and the projectification is that you have these temporary shells around a core group of staff. So you always have this kind of factory of temporary positions that work on these short-term goals and projects. And one of the things I think maybe clumsily formulated in answering a previous question was indeed this program and mission orientation. I mean, not mission in the sense of impact, but that you have a strategic plan for a program that lasts for not a couple of years, but that is much more institutionally embedded for maybe even 10 years or so. And of course you can then navigate and change course, but you have that kind of anchor for making decisions and an orientation for the work. And maybe for a hospital context that is slightly easier to develop. But I mean, we should be able, on a discipline level, for instance, to think about what's the relevance of psychology in a certain country. What are we good at here, and who does it serve? And what can we then do in these different institutions that work on or that house psychologists or astronomers or whatever? And how can we then not compete, but work together in these national contexts? It's a really different way of thinking about it, but I think in the end, we need to work towards something like that.
I'm conscious of time. Do you have to leave?
In 10 minutes. Yeah.
Can I just slip in one more question that should take about 10 minutes to answer? So in all of this, I see a potential risk in retreating from globalisms into nationalisms. And again, there's a positive side to that and there's a negative side to that. But I think increasingly we're seeing the negative side of retreats into nationalisms in the EU with the UK, and in the US obviously, and withdrawing from lots of multilateral organisations and entering into bilateral agreements. Science, as it's been developed throughout the 20th, or the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, is deliberately very global. And you mentioned big science projects before, but you know, I mean, it requires that, and a lot of the big problems that we're facing are global problems and not just national problems. Is there any risk in these kinds of ideas fostering that retreat into nationalism at the expense of globalism? And I think as well about coming back to the idea of impact evaluation and assessment. It's very hard to quantify things the bigger and more complicated and the more strands and networked it all is. Whereas it's very easy to quantify much more local things that are much more contained. And I just see that there's potentially, if done incorrectly, it could just foster a retreat into the bad kind of nationalisms.
Yeah, I guess that is a real risk. And again, yeah, it refers back to this point about leadership and the relation with political leadership and academic forms of leadership. And I guess it's really dependent on the national political system, whether or not this goes in that direction. Because there's, in many science systems, there's this direct relationship between the performance measurement systems and what governments invest and want to get out of it. So in the Netherlands, it's not the case that there's this direct link, but still the political democratic system we have, you can really see how that is mirrored in the way we assess research and questions around impact. So it again points to this complex interrelationship between political and academic forms of governance. I don't know. Yeah, I guess you could instrumentalize impact to the level in which it becomes extremely parochial or totally nationalist in ways that some academics might become very uncomfortable. I must say, I don't think that has been studied carefully enough. I'm not aware of good studies that look at that. It's an extremely academically interesting question and a big concern. The measuring or charting or trying to bring impact into the picture is of course an unresolved issue that has been on the agenda of experts in science policy and research evaluation for a couple of decades now. But having said that, it's becoming much more prominent because of the political condition of the world right now. So it can go a lot of ways, and it's very worrisome, of course, in the UK, for instance, but also in other countries. Leadership affects greatly the type of funding that is made available and the type of accountability systems that are being put in place. That's not only about impact, but it's a much broader problem, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like the benefit of academic freedom as a protection from the outside world is that science can develop at a different pace from various publics. But the more that it's opened up and democratized, and the more that it's tied to democratic decision-making processes outside of the scientific community, the more it's going to just follow the trends of the broader public and not be able to remain apart from it, which has its advantages.
Yeah, but I think I would also argue for an increased engagement of scientific experts or scholars in that broader space, because we can, we do, well, we, not me, but scientists or scholars that know how political systems work and that do know their stuff about these accountability relations. They should now do broader impact by contributing to those debates and let their voices be heard. So I don't think retreating into, maybe that's not what you were suggesting, but retreating into this type of ivory tower, free space, basic research, blue sky type of logic is what we should do. We should actually step up and participate even more in these maybe increasingly non-democratic spaces.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an appeal in retreating into the ivory tower. I think that's been part of the problem, perhaps, over the last, 50, 60 years.